Welcome if you're new with us. It's really great to have you here. I'm assuming a few more people will stroll in as they're able to get here. We'll just give an outline. Last week we started with Faith Ann laying out the science, particularly from the science findings that have and publications that have come out recently have given us a chance to look at that and wrestle with some of the science. Tonight we welcome Dane Scott from the Center for Ethics, who will get into the ethical implications that all may have for us. Next week we'll have Steve Schwartz from the Communication Department. This is Steve over here. And we'll talk about the rhetoric, how climate change has been talked about in the media and in politics, and how we might talk about it, and we'll continue that conversation. And from there, we'll move into some of the theological issues and implications, and then get into the philosophy and practices of faith. I also want to draw your attention to on each of the tables, there's a brochure for a workshop, Faithful Advocacy for All Creation. Jessie Dye from Earth Ministries is coming over, and this is what she does for a living, talks with groups about practical, tangible ways that we can engage and make a difference individually, collectively, as congregations, and also in the political realm. And so that will be Saturday on November 10th. So thank you for coming. We'll say a little bit more about the evening.
I also want to welcome you, especially from the group called the Western Montana Spiritual Development Council, which is a somewhat loose affiliation of about 25 churches and fellowships whose lay members have gotten together to sponsor speakers like Jim Wallace and like this series, so that we can come together around some of the great issues of our time and also look at them from a faith perspective. I see people here from a lot of our different fellowships and congregations, so it's a wonderful kind of collection that we've drawn together. I want to point out on the format, we're going to hear from Dane Scott, and then if you notice, you're not all sitting in rows staring at the speaker, you're at tables. And this is following a model that the Missoula City Club actually uses, where after the speaker, you're going to be asked to talk with each other about your questions and concerns and any feedback you might want to give the speaker, and then we'll have a time for that at the end. So we'll split the last 40-some minutes into about 15 or 20 minutes of table talk, and then some time where Dane may not be able to answer your questions, but at least you can give him some idea of what your table said. So we'll ask the facilitators at each table to help make sure everybody gets a turn, that everybody feels like they were heard and their concerns voiced, and then maybe one person from the table will volunteer or be volunteered to do that. And I also want to encourage you to sign up for the workshop. We need to know that people are coming so that we know we can afford to bring Jessie Dye here. We're sharing her with environmental studies, but at least half of the cost is the cost we want to bear. So there is a small fee. We think it'll be a great time, and if you make even one of these talks and can come to the workshop, we hope to have a lot of information there for you. We are accepting small donations to help defray the cost of the ballroom. If you donated last time, you're donated. Don't feel like you have to do it every time you came. We mean these to be really free and at no charge, but those of you who feel you can contribute, we would appreciate it so that we can kind of protect our modest reserves and do it again. And thank you, and now Dane Scott will get us started with what looks to be a perfect problem.
Well, thank you for coming out. Hopefully I won't get too loud with this microphone. I'm not used to this. And usually if I see somebody sleeping in the back, I get really loud and try to project. So this could overdo it. When you talk about something like climate change, I didn't go in to be a preacher because I thought I might look too much like a hypocrite. But when you get into climate change, it's really tough, because I know I'm not doing enough, although we're saving for a Prius right now. And we'll see if we can get one. But climate change is the perfect problem. And the reason is it comes from a confluence of forces that just makes it extremely difficult to comprehend and to deal with. There's a book that came out, Americans and Climate Change, where at the Yale School of Forestry, they gathered together about 200 scholars, politicians, scientists, and they created a document with a lot of recommendations. And they start off their document with the idea that this is the perfect problem. And I'm going to go through a list of very depressing things that kind of point out why this problem is so difficult. The first place is it's complex. We were all here listening to Faith Ann the other day, and she made the science very accessible to us. Nonetheless, it's still difficult. Faith Ann was explaining to me what an environmental physicist does, and that was hard to grasp. It is difficult science with complex modeling. Climate is very tough. There's a substantial and uncertain time lag between cause and effect. And we all know we like to put off things. And with this particular problem, it gains steam, it gains momentum, yet the real effects take quite a bit of time. And so our sort of propensity to put things off puts us at risk. There's inertia in all the key drivers of the problem, from demographic growth to long-lived energy infrastructure to ingrained daily habits, such as getting in your car instead of hopping on your bike to get to work, a habit I'm trying to break, to household level, just the way we live. There's just a tremendous amount of inertia built into our way of life that makes this a difficult problem. There's psychological barriers that complicate the apprehension and processing of the issue. It's just grasp. It's the world climate, and it's tough to get a hold of, due in part to its perceived remoteness in time and place. And this is a problem. There's partisan, cultural, and other filters that cause social discounting or obfuscation of the threat. If you look at the Pew Pew has a big climate change initiative, and they do surveys, and it divides up. Republicans tend to not think it's happening. Democrats do, which seems weird. It shouldn't be that way. This is a scientific issue that affects us all. And having a partisan political divide on that just doesn't seem to make sense, and yet that is present. It's a reality, something that needs to be overcome. There's motivational obstacles, especially the futility associated with what is perhaps the quintessentially collective action problem of our time. We can do all we want in Missoula, but we know that it only takes 10 days, we heard from Faith Ann, for the climate to move around. So if we stop our greenhouse gases, it's not going to help Missoula. It's going to spread all over the globe. So we have to get the whole world to act on this problem. I know I did a class called The Ethical Dimensions of Climate Change, and we begin the class by saying, in about 5 years, China's going to catch up and surpass the U.S. in greenhouse gas emissions. About midway through the course, we were picking up things that'll be a couple years. By the end of the course, they were by us. It's kind of like looking in your rearview mirror. Objects are closer than they seem, right? With an 18% growth in its economy, it's just zooming by us, and it's built on fossil fuel. There's a mismatch between the global cross-sectorial scope of climate change issues and the jurisdiction, focus, and capacity of existing institutions. We really don't have the institutions internationally to deal with this problem right now. This is particularly true in terms of adaptation. Climate change is going to affect a lot of poor people around the globe, and yet they never benefited from the Industrial Revolution and the use of fossil fuels to have their economy grow. And yet they're going to be severely affected. How are they going to be compensated? Well, new institutions, new global international institutions will have to be created to deal with this particular problem, for example. A set of hardwired incentives, career, otherwise, that inhibit focused attention and action on these issues. Just the way we live is built around a fossil fuel economy. And so we'll have to change many things, and so it's going to be difficult. Well, that can sound pretty hopeless. We have a really daunting problem, a short time to do it. and we could just have a sense of hopelessness. And so you have these things combined. There's a sense of urgency to do with something about it. And I'm assuming all the science is right, that Faith Ann made her case last Tuesday night, along with all the IPCC scientists working on this issue. So I'd like to impart a sense of urgency, but also a sense of hope, that we actually can tackle this, and not only tackle this with our teeth gritted, but this might actually be really kind of interesting, a sort of challenge that we would like to meet, in a sense. So the way I'd like to do this is by focusing on intergenerational justice. And the reason I'm doing that is we're thinking about future people, our grandchildren, our children. Part of the thing with global warming is most of us in this room won't be around when the really bad things happen, if they do. And it's highly likely that they will happen. This is about there's a long time lag between this. So I really think focusing on our children, our grandchildren, which are hope for any community. Children are the hope. The next thing I'm going to look at is a basic moral insight, the golden rule. And I think that way I don't have to get into these complex things. When you go into philosophy and look at the discussion on intergenerational justice, your head spins. I don't understand it, and I was trained as a philosopher. So I think I'm going to focus on just a very simple insights, the golden rule, and what I'm calling the moral insight. The second one is I'm trying to provide you with a few concepts that I think will be helpful in dealing with the problem. One is the golden rule, the moral insight. We're going to focus on intergenerational justice. And these two ideas of place prosperity and individual wealth prosperity. I think that's a nice contrast when thinking about future generations. And I'll develop that later. And I'd like to us imagine alternative futures. What we do really does make a difference. We go one way, the world's a different way. We go another way, the world's one way. And I think if we imagine alternative hopeful futures, I think that can be helpful. And then there's a key idea that I found in a philosopher by the name of Henry Shue. And it's this notion of the date of technological transition. And I think that helps us get a pretty defined target, what we're after. If you're going to shoot for a goal, you have a task, you want to go for it, it's good to have a really clear picture of what you're trying to accomplish. And I think Shue does a good job of setting that out. So just very quickly, the Industrial Revolution, right? Thinking about this. I'm not going to go back to the beginning of history. This is going to go fast. The Industrial Revolution has been very good to us. The burning of fossil fuels has increased life expectancy, given us wealth, helped us create universities, colleges, build cathedrals. It's done a lot for us. But it's had an unfortunate side effect, as we all know, the generation of greenhouse gases. And we know that they've been increasing at a fast rate in our atmosphere. I'm going very quick through this because you've heard this before, I think. So by the year 21,000, where the concentration of CO2 will have greatly increased. Now notice all of these times we have ranges, and the ranges create our options. And that's really what we're after is to try to work within these ranges, because you're not going to stop this problem. It's already here. We want to make sure that the problem can be dealt with by future generations or not going to create harm for them. So here's another range, and this changes a lot, but there's a range in global temperatures that might change, and we obviously once again want to be on the low side. And I think the point here is if we're on the low side, we put future generations at less risk for harm. And what we want to do is avoid climate surprises. In other words, it's not as though there's a linear relationship with temperature and bad things happening due to climate. It's like going 60 if you get into an accident, but if you're going 120, it's not as though it's just going to be twice as bad. You're probably going to be dead, right, if you're going 120. And notice the sea level rises. I think that's going to be an important thing, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I think most people think that we want to hit that 2 degrees Celsius. We want to keep it down below that because that'll minimize the kinds of climate surprises that we might be having. Okay. So we have a target, a goal. And you'll find this being repeated now in the literature. We want to achieve a fair and effective global response to climate change. I think that's pretty indisputable. No one wants an unfair and ineffective response, such as it is. But then you have to ask the question, well, what constitutes a fair response? And that's a complicated issue. And I look at this, it was like when bioethics came out. It gave philosophers a lot to do, sort of was a growth industry. And I think climate change is that way too. The number of ethical issues just go on and on that are associated with what constitutes a fair response to global climate change. And what constitutes an effective response? I've sort of hinted at that already. I think it's keeping it below 2 degrees C, if at all possible, if that number is correct. So the general alternative approaches are adaptation. There are some economists that think that responding to global climate change, trying to change our economy, doesn't make sense economically. That the better thing to do would be adaptation, to use that money to help poor folks out that are being hit by climate change and to just deal with it. Of course, that doesn't take into account climate surprises and catastrophes. The other thing is mitigation. Now, oftentimes environmentalists don't want to talk too much about adaptation because that means we're giving up, and they more focus on mitigation. But many things are going to happen as it is. We are going to have to adapt to a certain degree. So I think probably wisely a response that both takes into account adapting to global climate change, we're already faced with some of this, and also mitigating its effects so that future generations aren't hit with it really hard. So the questions of justice, here's Stephen Gardner, a philosopher over at the University of Washington, writes, the core ethical issues concerning global warming is that of how to allocate the cost and benefits, we might add harms, of greenhouse gas emissions and abatement. So these are issues of justice. When you have conflicts of interest about cost, about benefits, and who's going to get them, these are questions of justice. How do we distribute it? And with climate change, there are a whole variety of issues. There's questions of distributive justice. We can look at the global commons. Now, we have, since the Industrial Revolution, along with Europe and everybody that's benefited from the Industrial Revolution, we filled up the global commons as a sort of sink for carbon dioxide. China didn't get its chance, right? And so China would like to go with dividing the global commons up per capita. Because we've already used our bit of it up, they have a right then to use their bit of it up to help their economy grow. So how are we going to divide up the global commons? That's a question of distributive justice in terms of mitigation. I've already said in terms of adaptation, how are we going to spread the cost of adapting? If you're living in a country that disappears, an island nation, how are those people going to be compensated for their loss of their country? Who's going to compensate them for that loss? Procedural justice. Who gets a seat at the table? We're going to have large international negotiations. We need to set up a way that everybody gets a fair seat at the table. We often know that the most powerful dominate the discussion. That's not justice. So we need to find a way to have a procedure that will allow for dividing up the global commons, for distributing adaptation cost. Then there's intergenerational justice, and that's what I'm going to focus on because I wanted to focus on hope and future generation. Then there's questions of environmental justice, and I think a friend of mine said that, Jim Birchfield said that the polar bear may become the icon for global climate change. I mean, we're reading about the polar bear and the fact that they have to swim these great distances and are dying in order to get from one ice floe to the other. That's a tragic thing, and I think that somehow really motivates us. So there's large questions of environmental justice. But again, I couldn't deal with all of these in one night. So I'm focusing on intergenerational justice. So how and to what extent can the present generation harm future generations? When we're talking about intergenerational justice, these are the questions we need to ask. In what ways should the interest of subsequent generations guide present decisions? Given our limited knowledge, and philosophers love to play with our limited knowledge, and I don't think our knowledge is that limited, and that's why I'm going to focus on the Golden Rule. How should we relate to them under conditions of risk and uncertainty? We don't know who these future people are going to be. We don't know what they're going to want, right? Necessarily. We don't know what kind of world they want us to leave them. In many of these questions, we don't have exactly that knowledge. And also with climate change, we are dealing with a lot of scientific uncertainty. We are dealing with ranges and probabilities. Should we take great personal sacrifice just to set them at some probable risk? These are the kind of questions we need to ask. And what motivation should we have for fulfilling our duties to future people, given that we know neither their individual identities nor their particular preferences? Well, I think this problem, there's a lot of literature, and it's very dense and difficult, as I said, by philosophers on intergenerational justice. But I don't think it's that hard. And I think if we just focus on the golden rule, it will be made fairly evident, I think, to us. And we all know this, right? So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this is a sum. This sums up the law and the prophets. The last bit I think is really interesting because it's sort of an axiom that all other moral responsibilities are generated from. So we start with something very basic and simple, and then we can determine our obligations from that. Not only that, but you can find something like the Golden Rule in Confucianism, Buddhism, in Islam, in Judaism. I mean, if there's any such thing as a universal value or principle, this is it, right? So I think it's something we pretty much share globally. Now, I'm going to switch to philosophy because that's my field. There's an essay by a fellow by the name of Josiah Royce, something of a forgotten philosopher called The Moral Insight. And he's playing with the golden rule. Now, most philosophers, like most theologians, tend to want their ethical system to line up with the golden rule. So you can go to, John Stuart Mill in his utilitarianism, and it'll line up with the golden rule, so he says. And you go to Immanuel Kant, and he'll line up his ethical theory to the golden rule. And so too Josiah Royce. But Josiah Royce plays kind of a game that I think we can all relate to. We all have future selves, don't we? Right? When you were a teenager, I used to race motocross. I did a lot of stupid things, and my knees are paying for it. So I kind of wish I could go back to that young adolescent Dane and say, slow down. You're injuring yourself. You're doing harm to that middle-aged Dane with the creaky knees, right? And we owe a lot to our future, don't we? How many of you are investing just tons of money into healthcare so you can take care of your future self if you get into an accident, right? If you make it to older age, right? How many of us are investing, so much into retirement? It's just incredible for our future selves, because you don't want to go back when you're nice and retired and want to go for those trips and say, darn, you middle-aged person, why didn't you save for me, right? We do relate to our future self. Notice if you saw there is a real distance, a sort of psychic distance between our past selves, our future selves. If they were meeting today, would you have a conversation? What would that conversation be like with your past self? There's this distance. And Josiah Royce says that, we take actions on account of our future selves. And there's a great deal of distance. And you look at the people around you at each table, that same kind of psychic distance as well. You're separated from that person next to you, from your neighbor, if you will, by that same way. But you know what that's going on in that paper. They're going to have dreams, they're going to have hopes, they're going to have desires, they're going to have plans, just like you do. And so that distance isn't that great. So Josiah Royce is trying to use this between your neighbor. I'm trying to use this between future generations. We may not know what they're exactly like, but they're going to be a lot like us. Just like our future self, we can imagine what that future self is going to be like, and we can act on our future self's behalf. It's not that difficult. So here's a rewriting of the Golden Rule by Josiah Royce. Treat others as you would treat your future self. So here's some other things that he has written in this essay. It's called The Moral Insight. But simply try to know the truth. The truth is that all the world of life about thee is as real as thou art. He was writing in the first half of the century, right? Using King's English, I guess. The truth is that all the world of life about thee is as real as thou art. And that's hard to overcome, the unreality of your neighbor, the unreality of future generations and what their life is going to be about. Pain is pain, joy is joy everywhere, even as it is in thee. The result of thy insight will be inevitable. We will know our duty, he goes on to say. However, we have a problem. We're selfish things. We tend to, by the way we are constituted, focus on ourselves. And says we have moments of insight where we see our neighbor, the reality of our neighbor, the reality of future generations and the world that they would like to inhabit. But we have moments of those kinds of insights with their accompanying resolutions, long stretches of delusion and selfishness that rule our life. So we have a problem. We have to overcome this gap between our neighbor, if you would. So here's the thing. This was in the Missoulian, and I think this was passed out, looking at future generations. And this was the headline: Despite grim warming outlook, scientists say there is still hope. We can still act, although we're going to have to act quickly. And this is James Hansen, who is going to be coming as a presidential lecturer later this year. He's probably the scientist. And I think it's a real privilege that we get to have him here. He says, I'm not about to give up, Hansen wrote. He has hope, he says, because he has grandchildren. So children provide the hope. What kind of world do we want them to inhabit? Do we want to put them at risk or harm? Right? We think it's wrong for a person to get into a car drunk with children in that car, putting them at risk. So we already know that we don't accept putting children at risk. This is referring to an essay that we had a panel on last year at our Environmental Ethics Institute. And this comes from The Death of Environmentalism. And it says, environmentalists have a vision problem. And environmentalists go around saying, I have a nightmare. And that doesn't sell that well all the time. What we really need to come up with, if we want to talk about global warming, you get overwhelmed with the nightmare. What are you going to do about it? And so we need to come up with something like, I have a dream, right? Martin Luther King, highly motivational, right? You want to get behind Martin Luther King. Every year I hear that. And you just go, yeah, that's the world we want to inhabit, the one he imagines. And there's alternative futures here. We can have different kinds of worlds depending on different things that we do. Now we can have this world. I think this is a sort of a biblical painting with a prophet out in the desert. Now that's one option. That's the nightmare. And then there's this one. That's the sort of future where we make the technological transition, where we change the energy, the way we get energy to power our economies. China is not going to give up economic growth. I don't think that's a possibility. I don't think many politicians are going to stay in office very long if they undermine economic growth. It's just the way it works. So what we have to do is decouple economic growth from fossil fuel. We have to do an energy transition, the driving force of our energy away from carbon-emitting or greenhouse gas-emitting fossil fuels, along with, of course, efficiency and conservation. And I see David Merrill's got a plan for all this, and I point you to his website. I think another idea that is very helpful along with this notion of transforming is this place prosperity versus individual wealth prosperity. Place prosperity is when we invest. I'm taking these ideas from agrarianism. You know, when farmers put in a vineyard that's going to last for hundreds of years, they're gone. But many people enjoy those vineyards for years afterwards. And I think as far as churches go, I really don't like this trend toward warehouse churches. You know, I really like the fact that First Presbyterian Church, the people that built that, really had a vision for people that were going to be around after them. And I really think this helps. I was at an Episcopalian church, I think, where we went in Cullowhee, North Carolina. And this was a beautiful church, well over 100 years old. And I used to just enjoy sitting in that. And there's some things you learn in the South. If you say, you know, bless their heart, you can say anything about a person, right? Or God bless them. Well, God bless this pastor. He was kind of not that good at delivering sermons. But because of this beautiful church, I could sit there within that service, just really benefit. You know, these parchment windows. And so I think the prosperity that was given to that place, this little chapel in the woods in Cullowhee, North Carolina, I think that really added value. And we see that in Missoula, right? When they built Brennan's Wave, they created place prosperity because generations will be able to use that wave. When they created the skate park, they created place prosperity because generation, that's going to go on for a long time. They're going to be able to use that. And when they built Main Hall, they did us all a favor, I think. I won't say that about the LA building. All right. But the idea here is, the motivational here is we want to create a world that creates place prosperity. And our society happens to be at this moment focused on individual wealth prosperity. This sort of cost-benefit analysis without the long-term vision. Now, the next concept that I said that I'm going to tool you up or provide you with what I think are good tools with thinking about this is a date of technological transition. And this makes a lot of difference for future generations. Henry Shue says climate change policy is energy policy. And the date of technological transition is the year in human history in which the accumulated totals of greenhouse gases ceases to grow. Achieving technological transition will require utilizing current sustainable systems, phasing out fossil fuel systems, retrofitting, and investing in alternative technologies wherever possible. That's the vision. This is what we have to go for. And there's a graph here that I created to kind of show what he's talking about. Fossil fuel, our emissions of greenhouse gases is going up at a very steady rate. And what we want to do is have that curve flatten. Now, the sooner we have that curve flatten, if we look at the lower line, the lower the amount of greenhouse gases that are going to persist in the atmosphere. They persist for about 100 years. There's this momentum that gets built up. So the quicker we act, the less chance there will be of bad things happening, surprise effects. So society A acts quickly. They reach the moment of technological transition quickly. That means that the level of greenhouse gases is quite low. Society B acts more slowly. That means that future generations will be saddled, if you would, with a greater amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere for about 100 years. So the faster we act, the better it is for future generations, if you would. Okay. Everybody follow that? Okay. So the physical conditions are where consuming what remains of fossil fuels could well lead to a 4 to 8-fold increase. If we allow market forces to run their course, we use up fossil fuels until the market overtakes, we're going to just greatly increase what our future generations will have to do with. At some point in time, it may be impossible to make mitigating efforts. It's not as though we're investing in something and then we're giving it to future generations to allow them to deal with it. We may create a situation they're incapable of dealing with it, right? Irreversible effects. There may be harms that will occur only if we do nothing, because only if we do nothing will climate change become severe enough to cause these harms. Here's an example of this. This is the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt that warms Northern Europe. I don't think this is likely to happen, according to Steve Running. But people have talked about this. But let's say that if we dilute the waters up there in the north, this saline pump, the waters will be diluted and it'll quit driving this warm current as far up into this direction. It will permanently change the climate, I don't know permanently, but at least for the near future, for generations, will change the climate of Northern Europe. And if you look up there, Northern Europe is a lot, it's really far up there. It's up in the upper parts of Canada. So the climate in Paris will become, I don't know, like Winnipeg? Could be. So that would be an irreversible effect that would just change the reality of life in Northern Europe if it were to happen. Another thing that could happen is, I think I might have gone too far, is we're dealing with these alternatives. Now, this website was also cited in the Missoulian. It's at the University of Arizona, It's a great website to go to. And I wish they would have done California. When we lived in North Carolina, they used to have, the problem that Montanans have with Californians moving to their state. North Carolina has the same problem that people from Florida, right? Now, the reason I wanted, because I thought this would really get people's attention, because you're going to have climate migration. In much of the world, you'll have environmental refugees. But in the U.S., we might have migration of Humvees from San Diego and Miami, packed up and moving to Montana, moving to North Carolina as sea level rises. And I thought this would really get your attention. But all they had was Florida, right? So just think, what might California look like? And what might these flooded areas, where are these people going to go? I bet you it's not to South Dakota. I think they're coming right here to Missoula, okay? So as you can see in this great website that this guy has, the parts in red are the areas that will be flooded with a 1 meter rise. And Faith Ann could probably tell you better than I, but I think we're probably set for about a 1 meter rise, no matter what we do. So Miami, well, it's partly gone. If we go to a 4 meter rise, well, Fort Lauderdale, Orlando, all kinds of things start disappearing. They go underwater. If we go to a 6 meter rise, well, Florida doesn't look like it used to, right? All those people have to go someplace. In the U.S., we can probably absorb them. But in places like India, where Bangladesh they have to leave, what's going to happen? Wars? Are they going to be able to absorb them with that kind of economy? It makes a huge difference whether we go for a 1 meter rise or we go to a 6 meter rise. And some of these choices are up to us in our generation. So you put these side by side, and I think it's I don't know what you think about Miami. Maybe you think it should disappear. I don't know. Haven't been there. I'd like to see San Francisco stay put. Other places, well, maybe not such a great cultural loss. But at any rate, at least for your sake of, preserving the culture of Missoula from migrating Californians, you might want to do something about it. Okay. So ethics of risk and uncertainty. This is Stephen Gardner, an ethicist, I said, at the University of Washington. The really vital issue does not concern the presence of scientific uncertainty. We are dealing with scientific uncertainty. There's no question about it. But life is always dealing with scientific uncertainty. Most of you buy life insurance. It's uncertain what's going to happen. We live our lives in uncertainty. But rather how we decide what to do under such circumstances. Well, I think most of us say it's okay to take risk with yourself up to a point. But when you're taking risk with other people's lives, I think the moral imperative gets more acute, gets more intense. When we think about future generations, I think it's important to think about taking risk. We don't know what kind of world we will leave them if we don't act. But I think we need to keep in mind, how are we going to deal with the uncertainty, the risk we impose on future generations? So decisions under conditions of uncertainty, we have, to quote, you know who? Known unknowns, plausible scenarios, and knowns. Surprises. Unknowns. Just complete unknowns. Surprises. So climate change and intergenerational justice, reviewing things. The current generation has a moral responsibility to future generations. We can imagine what they might be like. Not to let GHG concentrations exceed critical limits. To act as quick as possible to make that technological transition. By the way, I think that might be actually a fun project that we can sink our teeth into. I think it's exciting when we hear about the kinds of interesting technological transitions that can be made. And also people write about how we might make this world a more just world, a more equitable world during the midst of this transition. The research and development required for technological transition is a time-consuming process. Once you start studying this issue, you realize that we really had a pretty good idea that this was happening in 1990. And yet we waited a long time to do anything about it. We've wasted a ton of time. And scientific research and technological transition takes time. We need to get things in the pipeline. And I think we have the opportunity here in the U.S. because we have these fantastic universities. We are the best equipped nation in the world because of our universities, because of our research institutions to take action. We're good at scientific research and technological transfer. We're very good at that. And I think ought implies can, right? We ought to do it, we can do it. Okay. Delays in starting the process may not leave enough time for future generations to accomplish the task and avoid severe consequences. So a fair and effective response are the same thing. There is a general consensus among scientists that the level of CO2 in the atmosphere is on a pace to exceed 450 parts per million. That's kind of what they're talking about, the critical limit, to get that 2 degrees C. Although the scientist in the room can tell me if that's right. Therefore, an effective global strategy must aim to limit CO2 emissions to a level of 450 parts per million or less. So back to this graph. So, Henry Shue has given us a really good target, and I don't think it's onerous. I think this is exciting, that we can accomplish this and leave future generations a really interesting world. We can leave them Wilma theaters, Brennan's Waves, First Presbyterian churches, and all those things we like about Missoula, right? But we have to act quick. We want to make that curve flatten as soon as possible. So the moral judgment of future generations. Well, what if we don't? Well, we'll be dead. But what will they think of us? And this is what Henry Shue says. They were not for the most part evil people. They were simply preoccupied with their own comfort and convenience, not very imaginative, not that moral insight about human history over the long run, not particularly sensitive to the plight of strangers distant in time. Stephen Gardner summarizes the ethical issues as follows. Many of the predicted outcomes for climate change seem severe, and some are catastrophic. For gradual change, either the probabilities of significant danger for climate change are high, or we don't know the probabilities, and for abrupt change, the probabilities are unknown. There is widespread endorsement of the view that stabilizing emissions would impose a cost of only 2% of the world's production. And I'll let the economist argue that out. There is debate on how much it would cost us, but the costs aren't that great. So here's John Broome, another economist writing in a book, Counting the Cost of Global Warming. And this is what I'll end with, and then we can start our table discussions. It is people who are now children and people who are not yet born who will reap most of the benefits of any project that mitigates the effect of global warming. So it's what do we owe future generations? What do we owe our grandchildren? Do we have the imagination? Do we have the moral insight to care what kind of world we create for them? And that's only the future generations part. There's more parts of this story if we were to talk about adaptation and the global poor and things like that. But that's just one slice of the ethical dimensions of the global climate change. So thank you for your time. Yeah.
We are going to ask one of our local clergy leaders to respond briefly with some challenges to us to start our table conversations. Jean is here and is ready. This is Jean Larson, now from Our Savior Lutheran Church in Bonner.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm not sure about ready here. The person who was going to do this was not able to do it, so I'm a last-minute pitch hitter. Let me just make a few comments theologically about Dane's presentation. I think the most significant question from a perspective of Christian faith, and probably all faith communities, but I can only speak well to the Christian one, I think the biggest issue is the question of hope. Where does our hope come from? What is the source of our hope? And what does it look like? I was at a conference at Holden Village, which is this great retreat center up in the northern Cascades, and we were talking about climate change, and some of the people there were good Lutherans from Washington State, and they said, I just don't believe that God is going to let this happen. That their hope was in God, who would intervene in sort of unnatural ways to keep us from experiencing the consequences of our bad behavior. Some people find that that's where their theological hope is. I don't. For one thing, I don't see God intervening in all sorts of places where I wish God would. Nonetheless, I think that faith is a terrific source of hope, not for magical escape, and not to make us feel okay about being passive. But we have this wonderful dynamic within Christian tradition of death and resurrection. New life is promised out of the ashes, and certainly this move towards a sustainable way of living involves death. I don't think we can soft pedal that at all. It involves the death of our way of life, the death of our old hopes and dreams. But there's always this promise on the other side, right? That new life comes out of those ashes. I think Christian hope can also take comfort and have confidence in sort of the power assist of the Holy Spirit. And by this, I don't mean that the Spirit will come and coerce behavior. I don't think the Spirit works that way. But the Spirit does work in the context of communities to empower people to take action that is way more selfless than we are usually capable of. So I have some hope that the Spirit will continue to work like that, as the Spirit has all along. Finally, just a brief comment on the intergenerational justice idea. I think that's really intriguing, Dane. Thank you for that, especially. I think of my kids and grandkids I don't even have yet. Another way to get at this, besides the golden rule, is the Christian ethic of loving your neighbor, and picking up on the parable of the Good Samaritan, when Jesus is asked the question, who is my neighbor? Right? So in that parable, we learn that the neighbor is this one who is least expected, most surprising. Who is my neighbor? The next generations are our neighbors. I think that this parable and the whole notion of the expansiveness of the neighbor invites us into a warm and lively imagination about this. And it might be fun. I mean, Dane, I also really like your notion that this could be sort of a fun challenge that we could grab onto. I think that imagination of these future neighbors invites us into some really warm and loving, not just imaginations, but commitments to these future generations. And one more step on this. Who is my neighbor? And you didn't go here, but I will. The earth is our neighbor. We go back to the creation stories, and especially in Genesis 2, we have God creating, we call him Adam, but it's really not a him, and it's really, the word here is the inclusive word for human. God creates the human. God creates Adam, in Hebrew, out of the Adamah, out of the dust. So it's like saying God creates the human out of the humus, the earthling out of the earth. Yes. Who is my neighbor? Earth is my neighbor. We are one with it. And I think this is more than just looking for images that are interesting. I think that images like that can fuel our work in community and our commitment and our ability to keep going with this. I guess I just have one more thing. This I have a nightmare or I have a dream thing. That picture looked like it was straight out of the apocalypse, right? Straight out of Revelation. And sometimes you read Revelation, you think, oh my gosh, this is a nightmare. This is this future trajectory. But really, just a reminder about how Revelation ends in chapter 21. We don't have the total destruction of the earth. We have God coming down to make God's home among humans in a new earth. And that is sort of the trajectory here. So in that regard, too, we can claim the dream rather than the nightmare.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you for stepping up on short notice and getting our conversation going. We invite us as tables to discuss the issues that we've heard tonight, the things that have perked inside, the things that we want to get on the table, and we'll have a time after a while to bring it back to the larger group.
So, any questions, anything you want to, insights that came up at your table? You don't have to ask me questions. You can, I've been up here talking. Maybe you could tell us what you came up with.
Actually, Dane, we have one question back here.
About what now?
We have a question back here that came up.
Care.
But in the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned that there was a study done where in climate change it tended to be Democrats on one side and the Republicans.
Yeah, the Pew. Yeah. Yeah.
The question here at the table was, what led to that?
Why is that? We discussed that question too. We came up with a bunch of stuff. What did we come up with, folks?
Economics.
Economics?
That was the one I said. But
Yeah. I think one of the things we came up, people really haven't thought about this that deeply yet. People are starting to think about it. And I think there's also, I do this. I tend to, when there's sort of, you can gestalt something or something's a little bit ambiguous, I kind of look at things that are favorable to me. Remember when you were in high school dating, does she really like me? Or does he really like me? You kind of look for those signs that, made you look good or gave you hope. So maybe there's uncertainty and ambiguity with climate change. Not that much anymore after the last IPCC report. But, you can read it, well, maybe we don't have to deal with this yet, But I think people, once they start thinking about it, looking at the consequences, I think that'll change. We talked about a bunch of different reasons, but and there is really a reason that, some of these people, like Lomborg, right, the skeptical environmentalist, thinks, yeah, it's happening. Yeah, it's human-caused. Let's not mitigate, let's adapt. That's the best economic course. We'll come out best. And I think that's a debate. I think that puts my argument that I put here, I'm convinced, according to the people I've read, that puts future generations at unnecessary risk, right? And we shouldn't be putting at that kind of risk. I'm hopeful. Once, and I think we already see that. That Pew, that was done in 2005, before the Al Gore film. And I'd like to see Pew do another one, and I bet there would be a substantial shift. Yeah.
There is a more recent poll about 2 months ago. 60% Republicans, 80% of Democrats, and 90% of independents want immediate action.
Yeah, right. So it's really changing. And the one thing, have you noticed, just to get a little conversation, I haven't seen climate change in the news enough as far as the upcoming elections. I mean, one of the things we really want to do is we're going to have these international climate negotiations. Who's ever elected next is going to, along with dealing with Iraq, this is equally or greater. And I want a compassionate person who will promote justice out there. And I'd like to find out who that is. And yet I don't hear much conversation about it. Maybe it'll come up. I don't know. Maybe I haven't been listening. Maybe they've had these debates and they're all bored with those debates going on. But we'll see. Yeah.
One question we had on our table is that there's not a perceived sense of urgency, such as a terrorist attack or something like that. What is the urgency? How would you, if we have that date of
Technological transition.
right, to keep things at under the 2% or is it?
2% sees over the next 100
Do we have 40 years? Do we have 15 years?
10 to 20. What do you think, David?
Well, James Hansen, probably the best-known climate scientist in the country, said last year that we have 10 years to start going in a different direction. That means peaking and starting to reduce our emissions. And that was last year, so 9 years, 2016. Has to start going down.
And the thing, yeah, it is a super tall order, yeah. And by the way, Jim Hansen is coming, right? Presidential lecture, when is that? October 22nd, yes. Well, if that's it, thank you for coming, and I enjoyed our conversation. I hope you did as well. And a plug for next time, tell your friends.